It has its practical uses, certainly. I've got to be honest with you. I'm a pragmatist, and sometimes I have to use it in a work situation to talk about the people that I'm working with, because the majority of people that I would say that I've worked with as a youth worker, you know, it's in a city, so it is going to be non-white, you know, and I could say that if you ask me what young people I've worked with over the last 10 years, I could say, right, I've worked with white English people, Irish travellers, Roma, African Caribbeans, Somalians, Somalilanders, Eritreans, you know, I could go on and on and on. And actually, sometimes it's just easier, you know, if I'm filling in a form.
Yeah, there's not space for
all
this.
Well, 60% of the young people, or 80%, come from a BAME background, because you know what? It's problematic, but people understand.
Yeah.
But it is a very problematic term, because, for instance, when I first heard the term, I was like, okay, I understand black, I understand Asian. What I don't understand is minority ethnic.
Yeah, who are the minority ethnics yet?
Yeah, and I was used to being called an ethnic minority, you know, and up until probably the early 2000s, I just assumed that's what the term was, you know. And then in 2003, I was actually returned to study, and I started studying sociology, and the question of race and ethnicity came up one day in a lesson, and I came out and I said, well, you know, the thing is, being an ethnic minority, now I was the only black person in the room, and everybody went, you can't say that. And I thought, oh my God, have I been racist? Hold on a second.
Wait a minute.
You know, and they said no, and I said, what do you mean? And they said, well, it's now BME, so it was BME at that time. And I was like, oh, right, okay, so what does that mean? And they were like, black and minority ethnic. And I was like, well, who are the minority ethnics? And they were like, well, we don't know. And I was like, okay, and when did this happen? They said, oh, yeah, everybody's doing it. And
Everyone was emailed last night.
Yeah, I didn't get the memo, you know. I should have gone back to the Department of Racial Classifications and say, you missed out on me, you know. But yeah, so we now became BME. And then, you know, again, a few years later, I was talking about BME, and someone said, no, you can't say that. It's
Forgotten the Asians.
And I was like, yes, we left out the Asians, but we still got the minority ethnic, and I'm still waiting to meet them, you know. So I'm guessing that minority ethnic just means everybody else. But who is everybody else?
Yeah.
Does that include gypsies, roamers and travellers? Does it include people of Arabic backgrounds? And, you know, why don't we, you know, include those continents?
So that's one problem with it. It's just vague. It doesn't. We're not exactly sure.
Well, it
who
doesn't,
it
because
refers
you've got
to.
B, which is a racial classification,
Yeah.
and not geographic. You've got A, which is Asian geographic classification, and then you've got everybody else.
Yeah, minority ethnics, which you've already said.
Yeah, which is quite insulting,
Yeah.
to be honest with you. So it's, you know, it's a ridiculous term, and it's ridiculous to try and classify people in that sort of way as well, because, you know, just because you're white doesn't mean that you're Anglo-Saxon British, for a start.
Yeah.
You know, there are lots of white people in Bristol don't speak English very well, and, you know, English is my first tongue, you know, so it's convenient, but it's very problematic, and I can see why a lot of people, including myself, have a problem with it. But then I don't think there's really an acceptable term, because people of colour.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's
You
the
know,
alternative?
you know,
right.
what's that all about? You know.
Yeah.
I mean, white is a colour. So again, that's problematic, and it seems that we keep trying to find these terms to define people. You know, when, you know, maybe we should try less, but then sometimes you need to define people because you need to know what the issues are. So I wouldn't want to go down the route of, you know, what they do in France, where because of their secular nature, they don't like to put in these classifications. But then, you know, if you don't have classifications, if you don't count the statistics of, you know, how many people from each group are in the room, then, you know, I think you're going to miss out on certain things, you know, because once we, you know, if we look at, say, classrooms, for example, classrooms in Bristol, well, we can look at how many people there are who are non-white, and say, right, okay, well, this isn't good enough. We don't have a high enough proportion to reflect the community or to reflect the area that we're in, the school and things like this. And then we know to do something about this in just the same way that you can look at a group of people and say, well, there aren't that many women in here. Why aren't there that many women? Well, if you're not counting the differences in gender, you're not going to see those problems. And if you don't see the problems, if you're not aware of the problems, you can't address them. Mm-hmm. So it's a complicated one because, as much as we don't like these terms and we don't like to classify people, and even more, we don't like to be classified, we still need it.
So I guess one of the arguments for this term BAME is maybe an attempt to level the playing field. It's like an acknowledgement that maybe people of colour, whatever you want to call it, haven't always had the same kind of opportunities in the workplace or enough representation. And so if we have this category, that's something that, companies, institutions, organisations can say, this is what we're looking for, this is how we're going to make sure that this is a contingent of people who are here. But do you think it helps?
It's assuming that you can see these things, and sometimes the categories are hidden, for example. And it's about being proactive. I mean, we talk a lot about these categories and things like that, but then we're still talking about massive inequalities in this country. So, we've had the term ethnic minority, BME, BAME, for ages, for a long time, since I was a kid. I'm in my early 50s now, and I don't think we've changed that much in terms of equalities.
You don't think that maybe workforces or organisations have become more diverse as a result of having this term, or as having this concerted drive?
I don't think it's anything to do with the term.
Okay.
But organisations will become diverse because the country's become more diverse. I don't think it's made any difference. I mean, the example I gave was education. Mm-hmm. Now, I started doing some workshops and doing some work with my old school. Now, it was probably a 40-year gap in me going to school. And when I went and visited my old school again, I could see that, things had changed because out of maybe 160 kids in my year, I was the only black boy. Now the school has become a lot more diverse, and you could say, great, we're celebrating all these different cultures, all these different languages and things like this. But then when I looked at the staff room, it hadn't changed at all. It looked exactly as it did in the early 80s when I was there. So I think sometimes when we're focusing on the labels, it can mislead as well. Yeah. Because you can look at, again, say TV. You can turn on the TV and see black faces on there. How many of them made the programme?
So one of the things is that people criticise this term BAME is that it comes with this kind of assumption that all of us in that category are a bit deprived, when actually the kind of socioeconomic status of the various groups in that is quite varied. It's definitely not a direct correlation between you're not white and you're underprivileged. So
because there's, even within the categories themselves, I mean, we're talking about Asians. There's a massive difference.
That's huge.
Even if you were just looking at people whose backgrounds come from the Indian subcontinent, if you look at the outcomes from kids that come from Indian backgrounds as opposed to kids that come from Bangladeshi backgrounds, there's a massive difference. If you look at, would say black people, someone said to me once, what do the black community think of this? I said, which one?
Yeah.
Because there's different outcomes. Someone could be, I don't know, a doctor's son from, a Nigerian background. That's hugely different from my background, where my parents were, working class and came as part of the Windrush generation, so it doesn't really work in those terms. And I think that it can be misleading and lead stands to false directions.
Yeah. So really, I mean, one of the things that we were talking about earlier is that class isn't mentioned in this acronym, BAME, right? And that means that there will be, say, white working class people who are not given a kind of level up, whereas a BAME person might be.
Focusing on ethnicity can lead to resentment from different classes, because people don't necessarily feel, if they're white working class, privileged. And so again, it can really kind of miss out on people. I remember a study. I was looking at educational outcomes for people from different ethnic backgrounds, and this was at a time in the early 2000s when there was a lot of talk about black boys failing. Now, yes, you could look at the statistics, and black boys were doing or had worse educational outcomes at the time compared to, say, white boys, but they had very similar, African Caribbean boys had very similar educational outcomes to white working class boys, and also Bangladeshi boys, because it was more about class.
Yeah.
So,
makes sense.
you know, aspirational parents as well. You know, there are white working class families where nobody's been to university. You know, there are non-white families where, you know, uncle's a doctor, mum's a chemist, you know, someone back home was a teacher, things like this. You know?
In a nutshell, the term BAME, useful for funding applications.
But you have to be really, really careful on how you use it, because it is a convenient term, but also a very inaccurate term, because it casts too wide a net.
Yeah. So you think we could still aim to diversify our organisations and institutions without having to use this acronym?
Yeah, easily.
Yeah.
Really easily. You know, I've always tried to create diverse, you know, environments, and the way you do that is just make it inclusive, that anybody can walk through the door.
Yeah.